I think, to me, the magic of plein air painting is in the relationship between the artist and their environment. It's not so much about the painting itself, but about being present in the moment. Just detaching from the rest of the world and truly taking in space for what it is. It gives you time to appreciate and reflect and time to breathe. It's too easy, especially in today's world, to get caught up in the bustle and forget the beauty, because it is beautiful, and painting in nature gives me the opportunity to remember that. Once you start painting outdoors, you start to see the world a little bit differently. Start noticing the nuances that you normally would overlook. And once you learn to appreciate a rock or a branch, suddenly everything is something worth admiring. And I think that's what makes it worth doing.
Hey everybody, welcome to Foltz Studios Season 2. We are here in Saint Albans, Vermont, with possibly the best view in the entire city. And today, we're gonna do a cityscape. It's not something that I do often when I plein air paint. They can be kind of complicated, but can't pass it up if you have the opportunity, and this is such a good view. So I'm gonna give it a go, and we'll see how it turns out. As always, I'm gonna start with a burnt umber wash, just to kind of knock back that bright white canvas a little bit. Not only is it it's a little more pleasant to look at a stained canvas the whole time you're painting, but it has the added benefit of helping you kind of judge the colors that you mix a little better. If you lay your colors on a bright white canvas, they always look a little too dark. So having a stain can kind of help with that a little bit. Today I'm working on a watercolor panel. These are still good to do oil paintings on. I've done quite a number of them on here. The benefit to a watercolor panel, as opposed to a regular canvas panel, is that it's not heavily textured, so you don't have to deal with that really intense canvas texture showing through. The downside is the paint tends to dry a little bit faster, so if you want to work with very wet paint, you got to work a little faster on these. And once I've kind of got some coverage here, decent coverage, I'm gonna wipe it around, kind of spread it out. See how quickly it's dried. I have to re-wet it so I can spread it properly. All right. And to thin my paints today, I am using odorless mineral spirits. Now, there are a number of things you can use to thin your paint, but odorless mineral spirits kind of gives it a more watery consistency, helps it spread out a lot better, and it also helps it touch dry a little faster, so you can start working on top of it without too much of your paint mixing in, which can be a pretty good thing. All right, let's readjust this. Okay. And I don't need to be particularly precious about that stain. I'm really just looking to cover up that white, because everything we just put on will get covered in paint. So it's not too big of a deal. Now that I've got that stain on there, I'm going to use the same color to sort of sketch in my basic composition here. And I really want to show off the city, so I'm going to go ahead and put my horizon line way up here, so there's plenty of room to show that city off. And I love this hill here, so let's make sure that that hill is included in this view. There are some distant mountains out there. I'm not going to bother sketching them in because they're going to be very, very light. And I don't want to have this dark brown paint underneath my very light paint. Let's see here. Maybe that horizon line can be moved down just a tad. I'm thinking I would like the city to sit right about here. We've got a building out there, and then most of the buildings kind of follow along this line here. Like I mentioned before, cities can be very complicated subjects, and probably what I'm gonna have to do is sort of really work with the abstract in this painting. Lots of different random colors kind of splotched around in blocky patterns to indicate the city. If I were to try to paint everything I'm looking at, there just simply wouldn't be enough time before the sun completely changes. So I'm gonna get a decent sketch in here, and then we're just gonna kind of slop paint around and see if we could get something that looks a bit like a city. All right. And then down there is the bottom of the buildings. That's where Main Street is and the cars. Whoops. It's a little windy. I'll have to keep an eye on that. All right. And we've got a little bit of a tree down here. Okay. I don't need much in the way of details in this sketch. Really, the only thing I need to establish in my sketch is where my biggest elements of this scene are going to be. The details can come when I lay in the colors, but for now, I just want to know where all that stuff is going to go. And that seems like a pretty good place to start working in color. There we go. Find the workarounds here. And we can go ahead and get some color on our palette. I'm working with my usual palette of burnt umber, alizarin crimson, permanent yellow light, ultramarine blue, and titanium white. Sometimes I'll add a permanent green in there as well. I don't think I'm gonna need it for this particular painting, but I'll keep it on hand just in case. This painting has lots of nice blues and some reddish browns, and that's really going to be the majority of the colors that I end up needing. Okay. Got my extra paints down here. Now, white tends to be the color that I use the most of when I'm out painting in plein air, or, I mean, just in general, really. White kind of finds its way into most places, so I'll make sure to give myself a pretty generous amount of white on my palette. And with that, we can go ahead and start laying in some of our colors. Now, I think I'll start with the sky and work my way forward. That's something I tend to enjoy doing in landscapes. The sky is usually the lightest part of your painting, so as you work your way forward from the sky to the distant mountains and then to the closer areas, things tend to get darker and darker. So I'll start in those highlights and work my way forward into those darker areas. Let's see here. I'll go ahead and carve out that horizon. See what we can do about this palette wanting to run away in the wind. There we go, that feels sturdy. Again, I have a lot to get in here in not a whole lot of time, so I'm gonna try to work fairly quickly. The quicker you work, the quicker and less carefully you work, the more of this sort of sporadic energy you can end up with in the end. And, you know, depending on what you're going for, that can actually be a good thing. So I'm just gonna try to work this as fast as I can here. And there's our basic sky and horizon line. We'll move down into those distant mountains. And those mountains are really very close to the same color as the sky, so I don't want to go too far with this. And even that may be a bit darker than I'd like it to be. I want to get the general idea of this mountain range, but I'm not committed to getting every peak in exactly the right spot. You know, these paintings tend to be pretty impressionistic, and as long as they get the idea across and you can sort of tell what mountain range we're looking at, and that's really enough. There we go. All right, and we'll step back and take a look from a distance. Okay. And let's move forward just a little bit here. Now as we move forward again, those trees and hills are going to get a little darker, a little less blue. We've got a little bit of a hill here. I think I'll lighten that up just a tad. Just a bit. All right, and now we can start focusing on that hill on the right side, or excuse me, the left side. Again, a bit darker, a bit less blue. Now we can start leaning into the green just a little bit. See. There we go. It's a bit better. All right, we're getting pretty close to where these buildings are now. And in this early stage, I'm kind of working mostly with my shadow colors. I will start using some of the highlights relatively soon. But it is typically a bit easier to start with your shadows and layer your lighter colors on top. So that's just something I'm keeping in mind as I work along. Got some trees here. All right, and before I move on to the buildings, I do think I want to start getting some of those highlights from the trees in. And I just kind of want to work a little sporadically here. I don't have to focus on every individual tree, so long as my brush strokes indicate that there are trees, it should be enough to just get the point across. So I'm just kind of letting my brush move around a little bit randomly as I mark these trees in. And some of that randomness and noise should come through and sort of indicate that we're looking at a bunch of trees here. And as I move backwards to the highlights in the distance, they'll get a little less saturated, a little more blue. And I'll make my marks a little bit smaller to kind of indicate that these trees are farther away. Of course, we have the areas of that large hill that are in sunlight. Okay, I think that's enough to get the idea. So now I think I'll start blocking in some of the buildings here. The easiest thing is going to be to sort of block in the faces of the buildings, because that's where the light is the most even and predictable. So that's where I'm going to start. And for that, we sort of have this bit of a reddish brown color. Certainly not the brightest color in the scene, but it is a bit brighter than some of the colors we've been working with up to this point. All right. There we go. And I'm going to kind of work around where I see some of those little trees and things down on the sidewalk. I can mark those in later. And I'll switch up my color just a little bit every once in a while, just to sort of indicate that all of these buildings, even though they're made of, you know, the same style of brick, they don't all look exactly the same. All right. Now on the other side, we do have some buildings that are not red brick. So mixing up a bit of a tan color for those ones. When you're painting architecture, it's important to try and keep nice sharp edges. Anywhere the angle changes or you have a divide between one building and the next, if you blend those colors together, it doesn't read quite as well as a building. So as I work these buildings in, I'm going to try to keep that in mind. All right. And we have a more distant building way out there that I want to make sure I include. All right. Now the rooftops of these buildings are really where the challenge is, because it can be very hard to figure out what exactly is going on up there. So when I'm working in these rooftops, I'm just gonna kind of, let's see, I'm just gonna lay in different colors, these sort of sharp triangular patterns. And again, I'm not trying to get every single rooftop exactly the way I see it, as long as there is a proper indication of rooftops, then it should work out. Some of them are quite a bit brighter. Okay. Let's see. And we've got this one rooftop here that is certainly the brightest of them all. And that's a good thing because it has an interesting shape to it. It's not flat like the other ones. It's kind of got a peak, which will be fun to include. Kind of break up that skyline just a bit. All right. And now as I work my way down to smaller and smaller details in these buildings, I'm gonna start using my smaller square brushes. Maybe help out with that. And I want you to see when I start adding these shadows in, how suddenly these very flat, blocky forms start to look like a bunch of buildings rather than a bunch of random colors. Let's go a bit darker there. Now with this palette, there is no black, you might have noticed, but you can mix a very nice black with alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue. And if you want to darken a color, using either that combination or a little bit of burnt umber can be a great way to do it. Got a really interesting semicircle window on that building. move into the distance here and kind of block in some of those distant buildings I'm seeing. All right. Now that I've got a decent indication of the buildings, I'm gonna move on. I guess there's a couple more roofs here I can get in. Only take a second. Again, we've got lots of vertical strokes, lots of sort of blocky shapes. When they all come together, they should give the impression of buildings. All right. Now I'm going to move down to the street, some of those trees. I don't want to focus on the details of the buildings too early, mostly because it's good to have the full context of the scene before you start to worry too much about details. I'd like to see what it looks like once the whole canvas has been mostly covered in colors, before I start making decisions about how I want to detail things. So we'll start blocking in some of these trees and the street. And I'm leaving little spaces while I block these trees in where I'd like the light to be hitting them. And let's go ahead and start putting in some of that light now. Once we have that in, we can mark out the sidewalk and the street. And after that, we can give a little bit of our attention to the finer details. I love the way these trees are just really nicely sort of backlit by the sun here. I mean, they've just got like a little bit of a halo of light working around them. Step back and take a look from a distance. All right, it's looking pretty good, looking like a city. And let's get a couple of these farther back trees while we're at it as well. There we go. And I'll bring those right around into these trees that are in the farthest back. Those farther back, more distant tree line there. Kind of blend it all together. And this little guy down on the street, he needs some love too. And of course we got this last tree here in the foreground, catching plenty of light. I'm going to use a slightly more saturated green for this one, just to kind of make it pop a bit. There we go. Now I think I'll move into sort of the ground and sidewalk area. Let's start with this little corner of Taylor Park that we can see down there. Just a little bit of grass. And move on to a slightly different brush for the sidewalk and the pavement. And because the pavement, the road, the sidewalk, they're all kind of facing straight up into the sky, they're going to be catching a lot more of that sunlight than, say, the sides of the building or even a lot of the highlights on the trees. So I want to make sure I use a color that is bright enough to convey that. All right. let's take another step back, shall we? Okay. I think we have a pretty good indication of a city, and maybe even a recognizable city too, which is always a good start with this kind of stuff. Now I'm at the stage where I can start thinking a little bit more about what details I want to include. And I know for sure I'd like to include, you know, windows, doors, things like that, to kind of show the show off the front of these buildings and kind of indicate that this is a main street. These are store entrances. You know, you can walk into these buildings. But I'll clean this up just a touch first. Here we go. And I like that this building over here has these white window frames. They're all catching just a little bit of light on the bottom side. Again, there's just no way in the limited time that you have when you're out here painting to get every single detail, and that's okay. It's a fun game to try and see, you know, what simple things you can add that will give the illusion of all of that detail you're seeing. How few brushstrokes can I add to indicate that I'm looking at a building covered in windows, or a tree, or a rooftop? Let's see. Kind of want to give a little more love to this archway here. I really like that feature. It stands out. while we're working this in, I'll get a little shadow for that tree up on the pavement. All right. Now I've kind of got the main features of these buildings that I wanted to include. So, just gonna add in a few random windows here and there to sort of indicate windows on the rest of these buildings. And a little bit of that architecture in the bricks. All right. Step back and take a look. And it's coming together pretty nice. The nice thing about kind of working with the most basic elements first and then moving on to your details later is that it gives you the freedom to sort of bring it to whatever finish you want your painting to be. If you ever have to pack up early and leave early, if you've started with all of your big basic shapes, you can still leave with a painting that feels like a painting, right? And not something that you had to quit halfway through. But it also gives you the freedom to decide just how much detail you actually want in your final piece. All right. And I do think it would be fun to add a few cars down on the street. Now really, when I say I'm going to add a few cars, what I mean is I'm going to add a few blobs that sort of indicate some cars. They will not necessarily look like cars, but they might give the impression of cars, and that's what we're going after. A few white ones. And we'll bring in some highlights for those white cars as well. I like the idea of these cars also casting a little bit of a shadow onto the road below them. It'll kind of help show that they are, you know, things sitting up off the road and not just random splotches of color. All right. We've got just a little more time here, so. I'd like to bring a little bit more light into some of these rooftops. And a little bit of extra light on these trees here as well. Just a bit. Alright. I'm just going to add a little bit to this tree and this tree, and I think we can call that done. So thanks for sticking around today. This was a fun little experiment. Fantastic location in St. Albans. I will see you guys later. I almost always save the light for last in my paintings, but why? You'll see it in this one, and you'll see it in almost every other painting that I post. The direct light is the last thing I paint. And there are like painty technical reasons that I do this, right? Like how darker colors can be laid transparently. So they're thinned down with mineral spirits, they dry a bit quicker, and they don't mix into subsequent layers of paint as much. Which means that when I lay my opaque lighter colors on top of them, they're not going to get all muddy and gross. And painting the light on top of the shadows also helps me approach a painting in a more sculptural way, right? Where I get to sort of bring the form out of the shape. And not only do I find it to be more efficient that way, it also helps me spot when my form is like a little off earlier. And I could go on forever with reasons to do this, but the real reason is the one that everybody already knows. You always save the best for last. The light is what brings these paintings together and makes them pop, and holding off on it not only motivates me to continue the painting, but it's super satisfying when I finally get to add that light and see the painting glow. To support this content, go to patreon.com/FoltzStudio.